Distinguished member of our profession to share with us some moments and some thoughts. James W Osterberg is a native of New York. He gained his Bachelor of Science degree from Brooklyn College in chemistry. He has a Master's in Public Administration from NYU. Jim was employed in the New York Police Department laboratory from 1940 to 1960 when he retired. He then took up a position at the University of Indiana at Bloomington. He was there from 1960 to 1970 as a professor, except for 1 year, 1967 to 68, when he was a visiting professor at Cal in Berkeley. In 1970, he became a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago Circle and was the head of the Criminal Justice Department there from 1970 till his retirement in 1985. He is a professor emeritus from that university today. He has been a consultant to agencies such as the State Department, Stanford Research Institute, and to the Justice Department back in the days before LEA was invented. Jim and his colleagues were asked by the Justice Department to provide the assistance that that eventually became the LEA agency. He has consulted internationally on criminal investigations as far away as Burma as part of his job assignments. He was the president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences from 1968 to 1969. Jim, as I recall, once described himself as a candle string and fruit jar chemist. This was an interesting admission coming from someone whose pioneering book, Introduction to Criminalistics, in 1949, captured, and it was co-authored with Charles O'Hara, captured the essence of the technical approach to criminalistics, the analytical approach, in using modern instrumentation to its very best. And for those of you who have not read it, I suggest it even today. He is the author of a new book on criminal investigation, and which is going to be out in December of this year. Jim's contributions go far beyond just criminalistics. He is a lifelong enthusiast of opera and symphony, and enjoys both of those in his residence near Chicago. And I understand he's also made an improvisational debut as a ballet dancer at one American Academy meeting, but that is strictly an unofficial report. Reliable sources also inform me that in addition to his musical abilities and interests, he cooks up a mean spaghetti sauce. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce to you Professor James Osterberg. Jim.
Thank you, John, for that rather modest introduction. I don't know where you get these spies that find out about my ballet dancing. I was president of the Academy. For those of you who don't know what he's referring to. And that was a strenuous year in the Academy, to say the least. The business meeting ran from 5, usually till 6. It ran till 9 o'clock that night, and then we suspended it and had to get back the next morning. And about 4 in the morning, they called me from my room to come into the executive committee, and I assumed it was just the fellows there. And I just got out of bed, sleeping nude, came in and did a pirouette and balleted in about 3 women. So I levitated best I could. I'm glad my wife isn't there because I've never told her about that. In any case, I'd like to share with you my experience in the New York City Police Department. I want to talk about the book of Introduction to Criminalistics and some of the chapters, one of them particularly, that I reread recently. I don't recall how long ago it was that I read it, but it's as fresh as ever, and it says things that need to be done in this field. And then I want to talk about what I see potential problems addressing or confronting our field, presented by some lawyers and journal articles that they have written. Concerning potential problems, it reminds me of the biblical story of Moses when he was told by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And he persuaded the tribe to follow him, and on the way they said, "Hey Moses, you know there's a big body of water up ahead, it's called the Red Sea." And he said, "I know, but God told me this is the way to go." So as they continued, and a little further on, the murmurs got louder and greater, and the concerns expressed was more manifest, and he decided perhaps they ought to have a conference, which he did, and he called together his army engineers, the lawyers, and his public relations man. And he said to the army engineers, "What about this?" They said, "Well, we've never tried to get past a body of water like this. We'll do the best we can, and with God's help, I guess we'll make it." So he was buoyed up by this confidence. He said to the lawyers, "What about it?" They said, "Moses, it's water, it's not covered, we're in trouble." And he turned to the public relations man, he said, "What about it?" He said, "Moses, if you pull this off, I can guarantee you 2 pages in the Bible." So, in preparation for this talk, I had the 3 previous presentations sent to me, and I read them, and I sympathized and empathized with the John Cadman's paper in particular, where I noted that the founding fathers, by and large, were chemists, with a few exceptions being physicists. This matches the composition or educational background that Charles O'Hara and I had, I being the chemist and Charlie being the physicist and mathematician. I noticed that they said they were self-taught in criminalistics, or he said they were self-taught, as was O'Hara and Osterburg self-taught in criminalistics. I noticed that they looked for a professional organization they might go to when they went to the IAI, and found this wanting in meeting their needs, and so they established what today is the California Association of Criminalists. And I can sympathize with what they were trying to do, because in New York City, I had one of the advantages that they had of having others trying to do criminalistics, teaching themselves in criminalistics. New York City in particular is very insular. There's nothing more parochial than a New Yorker. I, in 1960, when I left, hadn't been across the Hudson River 10 times in my life. And I had gone up to maybe Connecticut several times because we went to summer vacation. But other than that, I was a typical New Yorker. Couldn't understand why people said it's a great place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live here. Now I understand fully what they're talking about. I was appointed to the police department as a sworn member on June 5th, 1940. That's a very special class in the New York City Police Department. Fiorello LaGuardia, as mayor, decided that he wanted to attract, this being Depression days, college-educated people into the police department. And he had his Civil Service Commission write an examination which achieved that goal. 39,000 people took the exam, 1,300 people passed it. And I was in the first class, appointed at the New York World's Fair, and Fiorello that day lectured Adolf Hitler about how to conduct foreign affairs, and the State Department had to apologize because he called Hitler a bum and a few other appropriate terms, but not appropriate for the State Department. In any case, it was the only time in my life in the police department when I didn't get a chance to eat. I showed up as requested at 8 o'clock, and they never gave us a break to eat until 7 that night. That was the last time that ever happened. Even the laboratory at that time was called the Technical Research Laboratory, or to say the New Yorkese, Tech Research. So, getting into the technical research, both O'Hara had a degree in physics, and I had met him in the academy when we would, by accident, sit next to each other. And he was a charming individual with a great sense of humor. And so I always sought him out and sit next to him because he always had such witty things to say. And we shared our cynicism about the instructors and their capabilities. And we applied to go into the technical research laboratory. Well, we were a bit naive. You need clout or to achieve that. Happily, the Civil War, I'm old, but not that old. The war was impending, and the man who was the head of the laboratory, at least it was within his domain, was a deputy chief named John O'Connell, who wrote the book some of you may know, was one of the co-authors of Sullivan and O'Connell, Modern Criminal Investigation. It's neither modern, nor it didn't have a lot to do with investigation, but it was one of the few books available. And John O'Connell was the only person that the police department sent to international meetings and the IACP meetings and so on. He was the only one who was sort of more or less housebroken. You could let out among the public. He wouldn't fracture the English language too much, and so on. So he, by virtue of this, had contacts with the English police, and he was also aware that we may be going to war. He knew that Charlie O'Hara had written a textbook on a physics lab manual. And so, wanting another book authored, he decided that he would bring O'Hara down and have him work on the material that he was receiving from England on what policing meant in wartime England. And Charlie was brought down and fairly quickly recognized that he would go stark raving mad. He had to do this along with the crowd that was around him. And so he told the chief, I need a helper, and guess who that helper was? None other than James W. Osterberg. And so we had a great deal of fun writing the manuals that was used to train all of the wardens, over 250,000 wardens. And that in itself is a great story, but it's not applicable to the CAC. As a result of this, John O'Connell, who had been passed over to be the chief on 6 previous occasions, was made the chief. As a reward, we said to him, we'd like to go to the laboratory. He wanted us to come with him over to the chief's office. We said, no, we want to go in the lab. And he also put the lab into the detective division, took it out of the police academy. And so we wound up in the laboratory. And my first night, I was assigned to an individual who was going to be taught how to do lab work. Went into the dark room, he said, you have to learn about photography. Went into the dark room, he reached up, and he had some of the skull bones on it, crisscrossed, and he said, poison. I said, what are you going to do with the poison? He says, that's not poison, that's development, but I go you look this way so they won't use it. He said, I've gone on in a different world than what I knew when I was a chemist. Puts hydrochloric acid in the sodium hydroxide bottle. Opposed to saying that's consulfuric. So we quickly recognized, Charlie and I, that there was need for trying to make scientific sense out of what was being done in the laboratory. And so we undertook to write the introduction to Criminalistics. I'll get back to that in a moment. But when we went there, we said, what books exist? So that we can, instead of just learning by apprenticeship, read some books. It's what you do as a college graduate. School, and write books. As I mentioned, Sullivan and O'Connell, Modern Criminal Investigation was one of the books that was recommended or available, not just recommended, but available. It's a remarkable book in some respects. If you read what he can do with hair, nobody still can do it, but they were almost able to tell you who cut your hair. The license number that the department's licensing had. There was a book, Alfred Lucas, which made some sense. He was an Egyptologist. England seems to send their best people overseas to India or Egypt. If you look at fingerprints, it's all work was done overseas, and the official work, of course. Galton was not an official with the government, so he stayed in England, and we're about to celebrate 100th year of fingerprints in this publication of his book on fingerprints. There was another book of Gonzales, Vance, and Halpern, written by the chief medical examiner of New York City, which made some sense, but it was more on pathology and things of that sort. But it had some relevancy to our field. There were a couple of books on question documents, some anecdotal by C. Ainsworth Mitchell, Another one that's anecdotal and more about crime labs. Again, an excessive description by Luke S. May. And then there was Albert S. Osborne, Mr. Osborne. There are only two people in law enforcement that universally are called Mr. Osborne and Mr. Hoover. Albert Osborne wrote in the introduction to his second edition, "It can hardly be believed that less than 15 years ago, no standard of comparison, no genuine writing whatever, could be introduced either to prove genuineness or forgery in the United States federal courts or in the state courts of many cities. In many courts, reasons for opinions could not be given on direct examination, and the use of photographs and microscopes and other instruments always was objected to, and these aids to proof were often excluded." He's talking about the year 1914. So 1940, things had improved to some degree, except that Mr. Osborne's obfuscated writing, this is on page 97. I pick this up every so often to get a chuckle or two when I have nothing else to chuckle over. But he is trying to explain how you identify handwriting. I know Dwayne Dillon speaks highly of Mr. Osborne and thinks it's a good book. And I guess it is a good book if you're a handwriting person. Anyway, Mr. Osborne quotes, says, he's trying to tell you how you identify handwriting. "The recognition, correct interpretation, and complete comparison." Now, first of all, I think that ought to be transposed and say complete comparison and then correct interpretation, but we'll let that pass. "Characteristics and all qualities are the essential phases of a scientific handwriting examination." Now, after I read that, I thought, oh boy, we're going to find out now what characteristics, elements, and qualities mean. So he goes on to say that the word quality, when understood as an element or condition of anything, is perhaps a better single descriptive term than characteristic when used as a general descriptive term in connection with the identification of handwriting. Although characteristic, when identified in its wider sense as anything that may describe or characterize, may be technically correct. Included among the qualities of handwriting would no doubt be its distinctive features, which would, more strictly speaking, be its characteristics. The word element, which refers more to the separate physical parts of the thing, is also an appropriate descriptive term, and in some connections preferable to quality. The word quality is no doubt a more general term and refers to a more extended or pervasive idea than element. Well, I leave that to the handwriting people to tell me what that means. But then we had the other book that had something to do or did deal with problems of criminalistics, is Firearms Investigation, Identification, and Evidence, written by Julian Hatcher. He had very little on evidence, only 3 pages. But the interesting thing in that book, looking back at it as I did the other day, it reminded me that there are some cases that he describes. He has a whole section on leading cases, which up to that time. And he has 4 cases that I've picked out because of his description that they really deal with the comprehensive discussion of ballistics evidence as the field was referred to in those days. And that's People v. Fisher, an Illinois 1930 case, 340 Illinois 216, State v. Campbell in Iowa 1931 case, it's 239 Northwestern 715, Evans v. Commonwealth, Connecticut, Kentucky, a 1929 case, that's 230 Kentucky 411, and Burchett v. State, it's an Ohio case, that's 35 Ohio Appeals 463. That was a 1930 case. I cite these. I have not a prepared piece to hand in for, and I understand this will ultimately be published. So I'm citing it because it will appear in the transcript and I won't have to do any further homework. Now, when O'Hara and I got to the laboratory, and as I say, we decided the text was needed, he had written the text. I was like the average chemist. I had written very little, and my writing skills needed a lot of sharpening. Over the years, they've gotten somewhat better. I'm still not a heck of a writer, but I can edit others' writing, and I can do an incredible job. Fortunately, my wife's an excellent editor. Between us, we worked on the crime laboratory between 1942 and 1948. All the time we were working, we worked all day Sunday, 24 hours. We got a lot of work done because things were quiet on Sundays, and we had nothing to do but work on the book. And we also worked around the clock, so we could go in at 5 and work up and wind up the next morning at 9. And again, many nights we had the whole night to ourselves to work on the book, and we spent a great deal of time on that text. We had no idea whether we could get it published or not. We submitted it to McGraw-Hill, who after 6 months rejected it. They said, "We think it's a great idea, but who would buy it?" I wanted it myself. We sent it to Macmillan, and they took a year to make a decision. They again said, "We don't know who will buy it, but we want to publish it because we regard it as an important book that should be published. And whether we make money or not, we're going to publish it." We said, "Thank God." And that lasted out of print with Macmillan somewhere in the 1960s. And well, I got a phone call maybe 5, 7 years later from someone that wanted a copy of the book. They offered me $100. And I thought, gee, it's pretty, I wish I got $100 for everyone who was sold, but it was virtually unavailable. I went to the publisher I was then dealing with, Indiana University Press, because they had published my second book called The Crime Laboratory. And talked to them, well, I asked them would they be interested. When they heard that sort of interest, they said, yeah, it won't sell much, but we'll do it. It's a favor to you. I said, how about if it sells 1,000 copies the first year? You want to give me 20% royalties? Oh, sure. They were so sure it wasn't going to sell. It sold 1,500 the first year. That editor was mad at me. While we were in writing the book, out of the blue came a publication sent to the laboratory called The Technician, which John Davis, whom I didn't know and only met once or twice in my life, was writing as part of his job and task at the Missouri State Highway Patrol. And for the first time, O'Hara and I recognized there are other people that have problems similar to ours, that have interests similar to ours. Because the lab people that we worked with had no interest in really, other than it was an escape from patrol. When Criminalistics was published, nobody in that laboratory ever said it's a nice book or admitted that the book existed. The only one that knew of its existence, I'm going to refer to as Mr. Nemesis. Mr. Nemesis became the head of the laboratory, and he would come on and say, hey, you know, this snarl, hey, you're writing a book. We'd say, well, what are you referring to? He knew damn well, I knew damn well what I was referring to. He knew I knew what I was referring to. And we said, oh, you mean the book that the chief wants us to work on? The chief wants it confidential. Do you want me to tell you what it is? He says, yes. I said, we'll put it in writing so I can show the chief. Well, you wouldn't do that, obviously. So we went along this way. And so in the summer of 1948, what I refer to as the alcohol mafia, of which I was a part for a short time, was working towards getting an implied consent law adopted. New York State turned out to be the first state. But they were giving up for this, and they wanted someone from the New York PD to come out to Indiana University and take a course in chemical test for intoxication, which Ronald N. Hodger, professor of medicine at Indiana University Med School, was offering, together with Lieutenant Robert F. Morgenstein, who subsequently developed the the breathalyzer, and he was the head of the Indiana State Police. So Fagan, the Nemesis. The Nemesis decided that, oh, it's hot out there, I'll send Osterburg. Well, that was the greatest break he ever gave me, but he didn't recognize it or know it. Because I met for the first time other people in this field. And when in 1950, the Academy of Forensic Sciences had their preliminary meetings, I was not at that, course, needless to say, Mr. Nemesis wouldn't permit me. But I had met Rala Hodge, who was, I don't know, he was the first or second, third vice president. And I was able to talk with him and say, you know, send a letter to the police commissioner saying you'd like somebody to represent the department, name me, and see what happens. Well, I was sent by Mr. Nemesis, was the police commissioner directed it, but I was told, tell your friend to stop writing letters. So he, Roger Hodge wrote the letter every year I went. This did not endear me to Mr. Nemesis. As a result of that, when the implied consent law was passed, I was responsible for selecting the personnel, about 25 patrolmen, training them, introducing the test cases at the magistrate court level and the Court of Special Sessions. I testified in those together with experts that we brought in, like Rala Hodge and Kurt Dubowski and others. I was then, without title, directing the efforts of this, it was called the IDTU, the Intoxicated Drivers Testing Unit. When Mr. Nemesis looked around, he was now the head not only of the lab, but I was one of the units under him. And he came around and looked and he said, you're not doing much. And he said, you're not analyzing narcotics. Well, there I was on the bench, analyzing narcotics. And I knew after about 2 weeks that I would be in deep trouble because the hardest part of that job was bookkeeping. Keeping how many cigarettes? Are there 120 that the guy submitted? Did you get 120? And did I use one of them or half of one? I would wind up missing something, goofing up because it's so boring. Happily, at that point, the department was interested in developing a college program. And shortly before that interest developed, a man named Francis P. Adams had become police commissioner. He was a Wall Street lawyer, a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, Senator Lehman, Governor Lehman. And he brought the police department of New York City into the 20th century, 50 years later, but finally got it in. And he was the one who was responsible for the liaison between the City College of the CCNY and the police department, joining together and offering courses exclusively for police officers in the Baruch School. That subsequently became John Jay College of Criminal Justice as part of the City University of New York. Now, as to the introduction to criminalistics, I mentioned that there are 2 chapters, one dealing with miscarriages of justice and the other entitled Looking Ahead. In the Looking Ahead chapter, which I recently reread, I'm amazed at how smart I was. Wayne Gill said, aren't you a modest fellow? But I'd say, read it, you'll see what I'm saying. In any case, there are 6 recommendations that were made. One was the need for an institute of criminalistics, which has yet to be realized. And I talked about advanced studies, having in mind the production of monographs by people who are specialists in their fields. To some extent, maybe Saperstein in 1982, with his Forensic Science Handbook, did something that I had in mind in those days, except they were chapters rather than a monograph. But at least it was a step in the direction I had in mind. It seems to me that both of these ends could have been achieved had Lear, if I've ever heard that expression, L-E-A-A, as I like to say, the only outfit that's managed to self-destruct, to get itself off the federal payroll. I mean, President Reagan went there trying to get rid of the Department of Education and couldn't. These guys, with the president supporting them, managed to self-destruct. Now, it seems to me at that time, had they put maybe $10 million into getting together in this country, one place, one university, and endowing maybe 10 chairs or 8 chairs, having a couple of chairs we could bring visiting people in, they could have put together a first-class forensic science program that would have been producing PhDs and feeding faculty, the needs of faculty for other institutions. That, as you know, was not done. First, we had two kinds of people running LEAA and then OLEA before it. They were either lawyers, and they're benighted about forensic science, about other things too. And then we had police people running it. When they were in charge, they were, I think one police department got money for buying a tank, and they all got money for buying nightsticks 39 inches long instead of 36 inches long. I'm sure research went into the effectiveness of the 39 versus 36 inch club, and so on. But forensic science got very little money. They did get some money, like to do the proficiency testing, which we'll talk about shortly. Another thing I talked about in that chapter was the need for some method to allow judges to understand who's an expert and who isn't an expert. Judges have no particular qualifications in their education in law school that permit them to do this, and certainly it would be helpful to them. Well, to some extent, articles are now appearing. For example, Harry Holliam in 1990 in the Journal of Forensic Science, volume 35, page 1417, indicates, in his opinion, what the needs are to be declared an expert. And he says, for it to be considered qualified as an expert, the expert should exhibit at least the following. Now it says at least. 1, undergraduate and graduate degrees in the relevant field of experience. 2, specialized training in the subject area as it relates to forensics. 3, some training in forensics. I'm not sure what that means. 4, those professional licenses or certifications universally required by recognized professional groups in the expert's discipline. 5, evidence of experimentation, teaching, publication within the specialty area, or some combination of these. 6, prior disciplinary experience that is directly relevant to the issue or issues being considered. Also desirable would be postgraduate or postdoctoral training. We don't have doctorates, so we're going to get postdoctoral first. Publications which appear in reviewed, and I assume he means peer-reviewed scientific journals, and the development of a scientifically accepted tests or procedures, association with and leadership in appropriate professional and scientific societies, and experience as an expert witness. Well, if we could get all our people trained to that degree, we'd be in good shape, and we wouldn't be hearing some of the criticism that we're getting from lawyers these days in 2 articles that I'll be referring to shortly. Now, there have been some recent efforts to show who's qualified and who isn't. The American Academy of Forensic Sciences have some sections where there are certification procedures. One of the problems I see with certification is that all of the old pieces are grandfathered in, whether they know anything or not. But I guess that's what the price you pay for getting certification. Old fellows like me can look at these young people and say, well, you've got to show what you know. We obviously know because we've been there. Latent print examiners have a certification process, but if you look at it, they require, for example, that you be able to classify fingerprints. That has nothing to do with latent print identification. But that's one of the things. If you can't do that, you flunk. I testify in fingerprints, and I can't classify fingerprints. I know what they do, but I have all of the arbitrary rules that if you don't apply them day in and day out, you forget them soon, and the rules aren't the same universally. They are almost, but not quite. It's in the extensions where you get divergences and differences. In any case, they and the firearms people say that there is no such thing as a gray area. It's either your fingerprint, it's either the bullet, or it's not the bullet. It's a bit like pregnancy. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You are pregnant, or you're not pregnant. This is typical legal thinking. If you're guilty, you're not guilty. I will not take the time to read, but there are a couple of publications, journal articles that I wrote. One was in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in the Warren Commission, where I looked at what the FBI had to say about firearms identification and some other people. And also Hatcher says there's no such thing as a gray area. Well, as criminalists, we're always talking about it could be, but not that it is. In an inquiry into the nature of proof on the identity of fingerprints, I again looked at this issue of is there a gray area or isn't there a gray area, and should we be able to testify as to it. In that particular paper, I think it's one that hasn't received much attention, and again, this may sound immodest, but the issue that I was addressing was, do people who admittedly are experts recognize what an unusual characteristic is? And I'm talking about fingerprint people. And of all the fields of endeavor in criminalistics, the most clearly identified characteristics are in the field of fingerprint identification. And surely they would know what an unusual characteristic is. And I got interested in this. I had a case where I developed a fingerprint in a homicide, and subsequently was in the witness room waiting to testify. And I was with the fellow. We didn't do that work. That was done in the Bureau of Criminal Identification. I was talking with the fellow who made the ident and said, well, how many points did you find? He said 7. I said, well, I thought you needed 12. And he said, no, 7's enough. A couple of unusual characteristics. Well, this guy was not exactly my idea of a Neanderthal, but he was close to it. And I decided that, gee, I wonder whether he really does know what an individual characteristic is that's unusual. The police department didn't encourage such research, and it would be hard put to publish if I found out what I did find out. But when I got to Indiana University, I sent out a questionnaire asking people in police departments specifying what the characteristics were that I was able to learn from the literature, because I didn't do this work at that time. I had one error in there, although I got this from people. They told me that you should put a delta in. A delta is not a characteristic, it's one of the characteristics located in a particular place. But I didn't know that at that time. I asked them to identify what's the most common, what's the least common. And this, mind you, is the simplest area of criminalistics. Some people gave a dot, which is one of the characteristics in the ridge lines. Some people said it was second least common, went all the way up to the most common. There are 10 categories. It went from 2 to 10, right across the board. Another island ridge, 12 people said that was the least common, and that went up to 9. People voted from 1 to 9. And there are others. Now, if you took the middle of the 9, you got a nice bell curve distribution. Some people said it's almost the most common. Some people said it's the least common. Well, from this one can conclude that fingerprint experts don't agree among themselves as to what is the most common, what is the least common characteristics that are used to identify fingerprints. So my friend may have been selecting something that was very common, because I don't know what it was, it didn't show me. And somebody else would, and it in fact wasn't really the least common. But it surprised me that nobody had actually counted the relative frequency of these characteristics. I'm one of the few people in the world who have ever done that. It's astonishing, but it hasn't been done. And I could go off on how do we know a fingerprint is unique, but let me just say it's a combination of a priori and a posteriori evidence, or empirical evidence, or deductive evidence, and theoretical evidence, and experimental evidence. And that's the subject of the whole paper that I was involved with, that was published, the results of which were published in the Journal of the American Statistical Association. And John Thornton and Dave Stoney did a critical analysis of the statistics, and I'm not a statistician. What I did in getting that paper written was I hired not statisticians, because when I went to them, they said, that's an interesting problem, Jim, but I don't know. And I said, well, how do you solve it? Well, we get mumbling. But I finally got some mathematicians who developed statistics for statisticians, and they worked on it, and they to a large degree, solved the problem. There are things that still need to be done. Just one other aspect of this. Some people in England, in India, had read of my work, and wanted me to come to India, and they said, you get yourself over here. We can't pay you fare over, but we will support you while you're here. Well, they had all sorts of grants to support science between India and transport science to India and America. I applied for a grant, but I'm not one of those that has much truck with Washington. And they said that it was a matter of $1,800 or something. They said, no, we can't supply that. We can't do that. The FBI should support that. And, you're always pointing somebody else should support you. I could have sent myself with the money, but I just got up on my hind haunches and said, enough yet, already enough. And so went on to do some other things. But essentially what's needed is to sample a national fingerprint file, which is what India was prepared to do. Get somebody who knows sampling, who's a sampling expert. And I don't mean a statistician sampling expert. I mean a mathematical sampling type that will develop the necessary mathematics if necessary. Go ahead and sample it. Make a relative frequency count. And then apply the tests that you need for independence of one characteristic from the other. And we will finally have a means of a specific way of saying this is an identification, particularly when you have less than 12 characteristics. And I use the figure 12 because that was a figure used in the United States for many years. England requires 17, France requires 16, France requires 17. Some places require fewer, and right now the IAI passed a resolution which said that there was no specific number required. It's up to the expert to go in. So if somebody wants to go in, my friend who knows unusual characteristics, could go in and say there are 2, and that's enough. Or there are 5, and that's enough. Well, it turns out that trifurcations are the least common characteristic, and if you have 3 trifurcations in a print, you can have an ident equivalent to having all ridge endings, which is the most common, 12 ridge endings in a latent print. 3 idents is equal to 12 ridge endings, and that is gone into in this Journal of the American Statistical Association. So that paper, if the thinking in there is replicated together with a little more sophisticated statistics, we would have for the first time objective decision-making criteria, which is one of the things that I think we're ultimately going to have to do. Here's when I wrote that. As I see it, DNA analysis and APIS, the automatic fingerprint identification system, have problems of compatibility. That is, the probes have to be made compatible if you're going to compare evidence. But again, standardization is one of the things that I think needs to be attended to, and to some degree is being attended to now, certainly in DNA and APIS, in the APIS areas. The need for standardization procedures, I think, falls out of the results of Joe Peterson and John Thornton's work and some others with the LEAA-supported Forensic Science Accreditation Proficiency Foundation Proficiency Testing Program. They also suggested that why do we wait for specimens and then try to find something unique about them? Why don't we label them in the beginning? Why don't we add some trace material that's unique that wouldn't be found so that when we get it, we can say by year and by area perhaps. And talking with Dwayne Dillon at lunch, he tells me that document examination inks are now to some extent. Something is done in that regard. But if that's so, that's the only one that I know. But certainly automobile claims for hit and runs would be marvelous to have trace of material placed in there so you could specifically say it's from this type of car, this vintage of car, year of car, and so on. And lastly, I talked about in this chapter the need for financial support to allow fundamental research to be undertaken, to have someone constantly monitoring the literature, searching the literature for applied instrumentation to the needs of criminalistics. People, in other words, might be a scientist, but they don't know what our needs are. They might have developed some technique that's useful, but that wouldn't be recognized by the person developing it because they're not criminalists. And so, and to some extent, the Journal of Criminal Law, Criminology, and Police Science was doing this, but not in this systematic way as it ought to be done. And I would want the journals in Russia, China, Germany, and so on have been done also, not just English, in English. collection of statistical data. That is the relative frequency of occurrences of clue materials. Now let me briefly turn my attention to the role of the laboratory in criminal investigation as I see it after these many years. It seems to me that everything we do in a crime lab can be described in one of three ways. The first is we do qualitative, quantitative analysis, essentially to satisfy an element of the crime. The package, the bottle that was sold had alcohol, and that was a violation of the ABC laws. Or the material that was sold contained a white powder that is prescribed by law. In fact, we had one case where they had so diluted the material, there was no heroin. It was a heroin in the early case. There was no heroin left. And search as we might, we couldn't get any color test for heroin, much less anything else. So we had to uncrank the wheels, let him out of jail. And the fellow, when we went to do that, was mad as heck at us. He thought we were trying to destroy his business reputation. He didn't want to come out because they wouldn't be after him because he didn't have heroin in this stuff. The second thing that the crime laboratory does is develop what I call associative evidence. That is, we develop a link or try to establish a link between evidence that's at the crime scene or on the person of the victim, clothing of the victim, and the suspect. To some extent, DNA is certainly used in this fashion. But the fingerprint is the most obvious example. And from absolute proof down to it might be the gray area, depending upon the kind of evidence that it is. The third thing, which is largely neglected by crime laboratories, I think, is reconstructing the event, reconstructing how the crime was committed. Herb MacDonald wrote a treatise, did some research on blood spatter, which is now used for this purpose and wasn't used before that to any degree. Time and reconstructing the time is very important. How much time was there needed for something to happen? There's a famous case in Connecticut, the Peter Riley case, where the community even didn't believe that Peter Riley committed the homicide, actually put their own homes up to get him out of jail. And subsequent rehearing, the time element came in and it was shown that he just couldn't do what was supposed to have done in the time available to him. Jack Chapman, in talking about, in his lecture, the first Founders lecture, spoke about the Overell case in which the blood on some part of the boat that was sunk had apparently coagulated. It's not the right word, what do you call it? Coagulated is correct, but that's what clotted, not clotted, and, or had clotted rather. And so it was still available, it hadn't been washed off. Again, showing that the time that something had happened before, long before it was supposed to have happened. And there are other cases where time is very important. For example, Paul Kirk, when I was out here as a visiting professor, used to have discussions about the Shepard case. He obviously thought that Shepard wasn't guilty. I tried to argue that he was guilty. One of the arguments I would adduce was that Marilyn Shepard's watch was found abandoned together with some other jewelry, which was taken, in my opinion, to make it appear as though robbery, or burglary rather, was the purpose of the intruder's original mission. But Marilyn Shepard's wrist bore the imprint of the bloody imprint, dried bloody imprint of the wristband of the wristwatch. And my statement is that people who come in to rob as a burglar and then kill don't hang around long enough for the blood to dry on the wrist. But in this case, it did happen. There are other reasons, too, that I think that Shepard was guilty, but that's neither here nor there, other than make some interesting discussions with Paul. Finally, the lab under Reconstruct the Crime has a role of protecting the innocent. And we'll talk a little about that in connection with the obligations of forensic science. Now, and that's connected also to the chapter I mentioned on miscarriages of justice, the penultimate chapter in Introduction to Criminalistics. There's been a lot of interest recently in this. Peter Jennings, on September 23rd of this year, had maybe 5 minutes on a case out of Huntington, West Virginia, where a person was ultimately released because they had been incarcerated, I think it was for 9 years. The movie, The Thin Blue Line, is another example of interest in this miscarriage of justice. A book by Hugo Bedeau and Michael Radelet claim that 350 people this century have been wrongly convicted. And while one person being wrongly convicted is more than enough, 350, if that's all, it would surprise me. But they go on to say that 25 of these were executed, and certainly anyone who is not guilty being executed is a terrible tragedy. Now, what are we going to do about all of this? It seems to me that one of the things we have to concern ourselves with in forensic science is making available to the defense, as we make most instances, to the prosecution, because we're paid by the prosecution. Making those resources available to the defense to see that you are kept honest. And I'm sure that you have no problem with having somebody there to check up so that you know that you can't futz with the evidence, and it will keep you on track. Unlike, for example, in Chicago, in the Black Panther shootout, a gun was identified as having shot a particular projectile, when in fact it hadn't. And the FBI and the Chicago firearms examiner said, I couldn't say that it didn't do it. I don't know if he said he would have lost his job or he'd been transferred or something would have happened to him because he couldn't call the shots as they were. Well, that's deplorable, to say the least. We're starting to see some editorials in the journal, in the Forensic Science Society, to the effect that we need, defense needs the resources that the prosecution has. There's a growing interest in ethics, and this is related to this issue of defense having some resources made available to them. There are, for example, Joe Peterson, it is reported in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, had a symposium on ethical conflicts in which he, Doug Lucas, and others wrote on this issue. ASCLD, the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, have developed, as I understand it, I haven't seen them, a code and guidelines attempting to deal with ethical issues. It seems to me that we have to have a concern over report writing. And again, we're now starting to see, since the 1970s, some articles discussing the problems of report writing. But things like 2 pieces of evidence are consistent in all measurable aspects. It's not a scientific statement, and it's misleading. People will think because they're consistent, therefore they're unique, and there's a unique association. Let me read to you in the Sacco-Vanzetti case, the evidence that was offered on dialogue between the prosecutor and the firearms examiner. District Attorney, have you an opinion as to whether bullet number 3, the fatal bullet, was fired from the Colt automatic Sacco's gun, which is in evidence? Firearms examiner, I have. District Attorney, and what is your opinion? It's great to have. Firearms examiner, my opinion is that it is consistent with being fired from that pistol. Now, I have asked students and I have asked the lay public what that means. A lot of them will say it means that Sacco's gun fired the fatal bullet. And as a matter of fact, the judge himself, in the charge to the jury, indicated the fatal bullet was fired through the barrel of Sacco's gun. So the judge, he was a hanging judge. I think everybody admits that now. On the golf links, he said to his golf partners, "You see what I did to those anarchist Italian bastards the other day?" And that's not exactly the guy I'd like to be trying my case. If they ever get me, though. Well, lastly, I think we need, as a field, to respond to the criticism that I've alluded to, which is that of law professors. One, the title of the journal article is Exorcism of Ignorance as a Proxy for Rational Knowledge, the Lessons of Handwriting Identification Expertise. This is by someone named, Rissinger et al., a couple of names on there. They look at things like, does handwriting expertise exist, the history of handwriting expertise in courts, and so on. Then even a far more far-ranging criticism is by a law professor. Let me go back. That was in the Rissinger article. Was in, again, this is to get it in the record, having looked at the Senate hearings. The University of Pennsylvania Law Review, volume 137, pages 731 to 785, a substantial article, January 1989. And then a far more ranging criticism of forensic science, not just criminalistics, is in an article by a professor in the New York University Law School, Randolph N. Jonicate. His article was published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology, volume 4, pages 109 to 191. Again, a rather long article, but like most law articles, it has 5 lines of text and then 30 lines of footnotes. But those are the footnotes that are interesting, that he's building his case. Spring 1991. Now, these people, being lawyers, trying to talk about whether you are or aren't a scientist, are at a disadvantage. But they're also citing sources and citing others, and not just making up whole cloth. And I think that a symposium or a group, one of the CAC meetings might be to examine these 2 articles, journal articles, or one at a time, as a suggestion for the next program chairman. Now, as to miscarriages of justice, it seems to me that we need to concern ourselves with this. And one way we can show our concern is to expand the use of the crime laboratory and forensic evidence. This means that people need to be trained in the recognition of unusual kinds of physical evidence. You don't have to be Dick Tracy to recognize a bullet or a blood stain, most often. But unusual kinds of evidence, and then how to collect them. And not only police need to be trained in this aspect of it. I remember in the Sam Shepard case, again, that the chief of police's attention, and he was maybe the 3rd or 4th person on the scene, was directed to a cigarette in the toilet bowl. Well, he made note of it, but he wasn't going to collect it because he wasn't an expert in the collection of cigarette butts in toilet bowls. And I'm not sure, I knew one source of those experts, the Bowery derelicts or homeless people who were brought to the 3rd Avenue Elm collector. But other than that, there were no collectors, to my knowledge, that were extant. But you have to know what do you do to collect evidence. And it's not very complicated. Even the chief can be taught this in most cases. We actually, the book, I don't know whether John mentioned it or not, shame if you did. The Crime Laboratory is a book that attempts to do this. It is a book which has actual police cases of physical evidence that was collected at crime scenes, together with the exemplars. And students can look at the 2 and see whether there is a match between them or not. I have a couple of cases in there where there is no match, because after about the 5th case, students start to get chesty and they can zip through much faster than I do. And I have a little zinger in it because they're wrong. And they don't know it. So the professor can catch them. That's part of our job as professors, to catch them. In any case, I am looking, it's the 3rd edition. I have not even talked with the publisher about a 3rd edition. I think it's about time to do it. If my wife heard me say this, she'd say, my God, not another book. But I would like, if any of you have cases, particularly if you're familiar with it, but even if you're not, I would like some, photograph A, Frank's evidence, photograph B, exemplar, and then the solution, because I don't trust myself to solve it, I want you to solve it. If you have any of these cases that you would like to contribute to, I can grant you not 2 pages in the Bible, but another poem of immortality in the 3rd edition of the Crime Laboratory. Lastly, I'd like to mention a book that is coming out that John did mention. It's entitled Criminal Investigation, A Method of Reconstructing the Past. I am told it will be out December 9th, but that is supposed to come out November 15th, so it wouldn't surprise me if there's a little delay. There are brochures on the back table that John has that you can read about. But essentially, in this book, I have tried to look at the investigative process across the board, including forensic science, but far more sweeping than forensic science. If you look at investigation, there are 2 kinds of investigation, it seems to me. One is where the investigator is trying to uncover the answer no one ever had or knew. What's the cause of cancer, for example? The other kind of investigation is an investigator is asking a question someone in the past knew the answer, or someone may right now know the answer. And that's called Reconstructing the Past, and that's the second part of the title of this book, Criminal Investigation, The Method of Reconstructing the Past. There are 3 sources of information, essentially, that if you were engaged in reconstructing the past, as is the historian, the geologist, the archaeologist, the investigative reporter, the detective. There are others, of course. There are 3 sources of information. And they are, there's physical evidence, that's what we deal with. There are people, and there are records. No matter what else you do, it will fall into one of those 3 categories. Well, the historian of ancient Rome doesn't have anyone to talk to, but he may have some records that come down in the form of tablets, or depends how long back you go, or paintings on the walls of caves, or Dead Sea Scrolls, and things of that sort. And they're limited pretty much to that. But the criminal investigator is fortunate in that he has all 3 sources of information. Well, I spend a lot of time talking about not only the sources of information, but if you get the information, what does it do for you as an investigator? Never mind how you get it. What will you do with it when you get it? It may be very difficult to get, like surveillance is a very expensive technique for getting information. But if the case warrants it, the government may very well be willing to spend that money. So you've got not only what information can be provided by a technique, but how costly is it? Can you afford to do it or engage in it, and so on. and there's a chapter in there on homicide that is far better, again, modestly speaking, than anything I have seen written in the other text on criminal investigation. One of which was written by my ex-partner, and now long gone partner, Charles O'Hara. I have one other comment or thought to throw out, and then I will be open for questions. And that is, we need to look at laboratories. Where are they located? Should they all be in the criminal justice system? If in the criminal justice system, where? Perhaps maybe they would be better off as an arm of the court. Or in some instances, they're in not public defenders, in the prosecutor's office. Or should they be in the PD or the sheriff and so on? Smaller departments can't afford a laboratory, and more they're finding, I am told, that the state and the county labs are so busy that the turnaround time for the small municipality is so long that the cases are being lost. Is there an area there where a private lab, perhaps supported on a retainer basis by small municipalities could provide the service that is necessary. In Illinois, there is one such lab functioning in that way. I don't know if there are any others in the country. If there are, I wish you would come up to me sometime. I will be here for the convention or meeting or seminar group, and let me know. And also come up to me and talk with me. Students used to tell me, you scare us. I don't know why I scare them. I can't scare my wife, the one I'd like to scare. She's scared-proof. So with that, I conclude my remarks. If you have some questions, I would be happy to entertain them. If not, it's been a pleasure talking to you. John.
Hey, I have a question about these challenges regarding how much information we need to have before we can rely on our conclusions. I'd like to think that I had adequate information about the conclusions I've reached in the last 20 years about various cases. But anybody can come along and say, now you should have better information, or you can't defend the information you do have now. Is there any way that I can assess my own information base and say I have enough?
Well, if you had a standardized procedure, or if you had decision-making rules, which is what I was talking about in Handwriting, as the journal article that I got published in the Journal of the American Statistical Association, essentially was laying down if you have what combination of characteristics, fewer than 12, allow you to say it's the probability is equal to that which nobody questions, 12 bridge endings, the weakest case that can be made. And there were decision-making rules for it. And actually, it was my suggestion, let's throw this into log form, and then you just add up the values, because that's what you do when you multiply exponents. And it's just a simple addition process. So, but there was one attempt, and we're not far from getting an answer to that. I agree with John Thornton and Stoney that all of the statistics have not been worked out, but we're so close. But you know, I got off into writing this other book and so forth, and I got up on my hind horse and haunches and didn't follow through. But once we have one example, you might go into, it seems to be, striations, and look at how you do striations. Now, given that the barcode is a method of examining barcodes now, in the supermarket has it, we could use, maybe modify that, because if all the striations, like the DNA, the striations are not all squeaky clean lines there, But that offers I have not had a chance to do it, and I don't think I ever will. I'm just kidding. But I'm throwing out an idea. It seems to me that barcode measuring device that's in the supermarket could be adapted, or might be adapted. I would say could, but it might be adapted, or adaptable to the idea of looking at and comparing striations that we find, like fingernail striations, and so on. But the need for standardized procedures and decision-making rules, I think, will answer all of the criticisms and make you feel happy.
Well, should we stop making any decisions at all?
Oh, no.
No, we have that data.
No, well, it'd be helpful to have it, but no, I don't think you have to stop. Maybe you're up to jump. Yes?
I had a question or a comment going back.
Sorry.
Going back to one of the comments you made about certification efforts, you may be comforted to know that the CAC certification effort even requires the old views to take the test.
Wow.
I live in Illinois.
You can still apply.
At my age. Any other questions? My God. You're not getting great.
Don't sit down yet, sir. It is rare that we have an opportunity to have such a comprehensive look back connected with such a far-ranging look forward. And I hope you'll join with me in showing your appreciation to Professor Osterberg. We present him with the Founders Lecture plaque, and this year it is inscribed with a description of the aim of this lecture. The Founders Lecture is dedicated to these individuals whose vision of a community of forensic scientists was realized in the formation of the California Association of Criminalists. To them, we will always be indebted. And I think you'll agree that this afternoon's presentation was a very special step in that direction. Jim?
Well, I'm pleased this is something unexpected, and I will hang this up on my bedroom wall to make my wife look at it for a while. But I'm delighted to receive this. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you. With that, we will break, take the afternoon break, and we'll probably be back in the room here about